They tied the rope while he cried through crumbs. The dust of the street was in his hair, a pale shroud on the black of it, and his tears made clean tracks down his dirty cheeks. He was small, maybe 7 years of age, maybe 8. It was hard to tell with the hungry ones. They stayed small. He had stolen a loaf of bread from the baker's window, a fat, round loaf still warm enough to steam in the cold morning air. He'd managed 3 frantic, desperate bites before the baker's meaty hand had clamped down on his shoulder, lifting him from the ground like a sack of twigs. Now the baker, Mr. Gable, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of righteous fury, the violated loaf sitting on a barrelhead like a piece of evidence in a hanging trial. The rest of Timbermouth had gathered, a circle of hard faces and harder hearts. They were a God-fearing people, which meant they feared hunger and disorder more than they feared God's judgment on a merciless soul. The sheriff, a man named Elias Thorne, was a pillar of that order. He held the end of the rope, his knuckles white. He wasn't a cruel man by nature, but he was a man who believed in rules, and the rule in Timbermouth was simple. You do not steal. You do not disrupt the peace. If you are hungry, you pray. If prayer doesn't fill your belly, you die quiet. The boy, Jem, didn't know the rules. He only knew the gnawing beast in his gut, the one that had been eating him from the inside out for weeks. He'd watched the bread, watched the steam curl from its golden crust, and for a moment, the beast had won. Now, as the rope grazed the raw skin of his neck, he choked on the last of the stolen dough. It was soft, so soft. It tasted of life. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the pull. He had been alone for so long he'd forgotten what a kind hand felt like. He didn't expect one now. Then a voice, quiet but clear as a winter stream, cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "Stop!" Sheriff Thorne paused, his arm tensed. The crowd shifted, turning toward the voice. It came from a woman standing at the edge of the circle, her hands clasped so tightly before her they trembled. She was Mara Quill, a widow. Her husband, a logger, had been taken by a falling pine 3 winters past. Her own 2 boys, not much older than Jem, had been taken by the fever the winter before that. Her house was at the edge of town, quiet and neat, a place people walked past with a sad shake of their heads. She rarely spoke to anyone. She was a ghost in their town, a living reminder of loss. She stepped forward, her worn boots making no sound in the dust. Her eyes were not on the sheriff, or the baker, or the crowd. They were on the boy. She saw the terror in his clenched fists, the smear of flour on his cheek, the way his small chest hitched with sobs he was trying to swallow. She saw the crumbs on his lips. "What is it, Mara?" the sheriff asked, his voice not unkind but impatient. This was town business. Justice. Mara didn't answer him. She walked until she stood right before the barrel, between the boy and the town. She looked at Mr. Gable, whose face was still red with indignation. He was hungry, she said. It wasn't an excuse. It was a fact, plain and simple as the blue sky above them. "He's a thief," Gable spat. "The law is the law. We have order here." "The law is for men, not for starving children," Mara replied, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. She reached out a hand, not to the boy, but to the half-eaten loaf of bread. Her fingers, calloused from chopping wood and tending a lonely garden, brushed against its broken crust. Then she looked back at the boy, and for the first time, he opened his eyes and looked at her. He saw a face lined with a sorrow as deep as his own hunger. She took another step, placing herself directly in front of the sheriff. She was not a tall woman, but she seemed to cast a shadow that covered the child completely. Her hands, no longer clasped, were trembling more visibly now, but she held them steady at her sides. "That's my boy," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. The words fell into the silence, heavy and unbelievable. A ripple of shock went through the crowd. My boy. Mara Quill had no boy. Her boys were in the cold ground on the hill. The sheriff stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mara, what are you saying? You know this isn't true. This is some stray." "He is not a stray," she said, her gaze unwavering. She did not look back at Jem, but she could feel his terrified stillness behind her. "He's my son. He got lost from me this morning. He was frightened. He didn't know what he was doing." A woman in the crowd laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "She's gone mad with grief." Mara's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes flashing with a fire no one in Timbermouth had ever seen in them, the spikes of rage, sharp and sudden. "Have you ever buried a child, Martha? Have you ever woken to a house so quiet it screams?" The woman, Martha, shrank back, her face paling. The crowd grew quiet again, the silence now uncomfortable, charged. Sheriff Thorne cleared his throat. "Mara, this is a serious matter. You can't just claim him. We have rules, procedures." "Then hang me," Mara said, her voice dropping low, a desperate warmth that was more powerful than any shout. She took another small step, until the rough hemp of the rope was inches from her own throat. "You want to hang a child for a loaf of bread? You'll hang his mother first. You'll hang me." She held the sheriff's gaze, her own eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. In that moment, she was not just Mara Quill, the quiet widow. She was a dam holding back the flood of the town's cold, hard justice. She was a hearth, long dormant, now roaring to life to protect a single flickering ember. Behind her, hidden in the folds of her worn wool coat, the boy Jem stopped crying. He watched the back of this strange woman, this impossible shield. He felt a warmth he hadn't felt since his own mother had faded from his memory, a ghost of a touch, a whisper of a song. He didn't understand what was happening, not really. But he knew, with the certainty of a creature that has only ever known danger, that this was something different. This was not the hand that strikes. This was the hand that saves. The sheriff stood frozen, the rope slack in his hand. The baker looked from Mara's fierce, tear-bright eyes to the small, trembling boy she shielded, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than anger crossed his face. It might have been shame. The town was silent, watching this impossible tableau. The widow, the orphan, and the rope that connected them in a way no one could have foreseen. Mara did not move. She would not. She would stand there until the sun fell from the sky if she had to. She had nothing left to lose, and so she had everything to give. She had found her boy. Sheriff Thorne let out a long, slow breath, the air pluming white in the cold. He looked at Mara's face, at the raw, unyielding certainty etched there. He had known her his whole life. He had stood by her husband's grave, and he had helped dig the small graves for her sons. He knew her grief was a canyon, vast and deep. He did not believe the boy was hers, not for a second. But looking at her, he believed that she believed it. Or that she would make it true, right here, with nothing but the force of her will. The law was the law. But what was the law in the face of a love so fierce it was willing to die for a lie? He slowly, deliberately, let his hand fall from the rope. He unlooped it from the beam of the baker's awning. The rough hemp coiled onto the dusty ground like a dead snake. "All right, Mara," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Take your boy home." He didn't look at her as he said it. He looked at the crowd, his expression a warning. There would be no more talk. Not today. Mr. Gable, the baker, opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. He picked up the half-eaten loaf of bread from the barrel. He hesitated, then shoved it roughly into Mara's hands. "Here," he grumbled, not looking at her either. "He can have it." Mara took the bread. Her hands were still trembling, but she held it tight. She didn't thank him. She didn't say another word to anyone. She turned, her body finally relaxing its rigid posture. She knelt in the dust, her knees cracking. She was face to face with the boy. Jem stared at her, his eyes wide and dark, full of 1,000 questions he didn't know how to ask. He was still braced for a blow, for the trick. Mara's face softened. The fire in her eyes banked, leaving only a warm, gentle glow. She reached out a hand, slowly, so he could see it coming. She didn't touch his face, which was still streaked with dirt and tears. She gently, so gently, brushed the crumbs from the corner of his mouth with her thumb. It was a gesture of such profound and simple tenderness that it broke through the boy's fear. A single fresh tear welled and rolled down his cheek. "Come on now," she whispered, her voice a little ragged. "Let's go home." She stood up, holding out her hand. It was a calloused hand, the hand of a woman who worked. It was not soft, it was not clean, but it was open. Jem stared at that hand for a long moment. He had not held a hand in years. He had learned that hands were for taking, for pushing, for hitting. He looked from the hand to her face, searching for the lie, for the angle. He found none. He saw only the deep, quiet sorrow that seemed to recognize his own. Slowly, hesitantly, he put his small, grimy hand into hers. Her fingers closed around his, not tight, just a firm, warm circle of flesh and bone. It felt strange. It felt like an anchor. Mara turned and, without looking back at the silent town, began to walk. She led the boy away from the square, away from the rope and the hard faces. She held the half-eaten loaf of bread in her other hand. As they walked, the small fingers in her grasp tightened, just a little. He was still afraid. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not alone. The widow and the orphan walked toward the edge of town, two lonely ghosts finding solace in each other's shadow. The hearth was not yet rekindled, but a single precious spark had been struck in the cold, unforgiving heart of Timbermouth. The walk to her house was a silent one. The boy, Jem, kept his head down, watching his bare feet scuff against the frozen ruts of the road. He expected her to let go of his hand at any moment, to shove him into an alley and tell him to run. That's what people did. They helped you for a moment, to make themselves feel good. And then they remembered you were trouble, and they cast you off. But her hand remained, a steady, warm weight around his own. It didn't pull him or drag him. It simply held him. Mara's house was small and gray, with a porch that sagged a little on one side. A curl of smoke, thin and pale, rose from the stone chimney. It looked like every other house on the edge of town, a little poorer, a little more worn than the ones in the center. But as they got closer, Jem saw that the windows were clean. There was a small, empty window box beneath the sill. The soil turned as if waiting for spring. It was a sad house, but it was not a neglected one. She led him up the 2 steps to the porch. The wood groaned under their combined weight. She paused at the door, her hand on the latch, and looked down at him. "It's not much," she said, as if he were an honored guest, and not a condemned thief she'd just plucked from the gallows. He just stared, his throat too tight to speak. She opened the door, and a wave of air washed over them. It smelled of wood smoke and lavender and something else, something faint and sad, like old memories. The inside was one room mostly. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, a low fire glowing within it. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A narrow bed was pushed against the far wall, covered with a patchwork quilt. In a small alcove there was a dry sink and a few shelves with plates and tins. It was sparse, but it was clean. Everything was in its place. Mara let go of his hand to close the door, and Jem flinched, his whole body tensing as if the connection being broken was a physical blow. He stood frozen just inside the doorway, a small, wild thing brought inside, unsure if it was a cage or a shelter. She saw his fear. She didn't comment on it. Instead, she walked over to the table. She took the half-eaten loaf of bread, the one Mr. Gable had given her, and placed it on a wooden cutting board. She took a knife from a drawer. Jem's eyes fixed on the blade, his breath catching. But she didn't move toward him. She carefully, methodically, sliced a piece from the loaf. It was a thick slice. She took a small crock from a shelf, opened it, and spread a thin layer of butter on the bread. The smell of it, rich and creamy, filled the small space. She held it out to him. "You didn't get to finish your breakfast," she said softly. He stared at the bread, then at her. This was the most confusing day of his life. People didn't give you food. You fought for it. You stole it. You scavenged for it. You certainly didn't get it from the person who had just saved you from being hanged for stealing it in the first place. He didn't move. Mara's arm remained outstretched. Her expression didn't change. She was patient. She could have outweighted a glacier. Finally, his hunger, that familiar ravenous beast, won out over his fear. He scurried forward, snatched the slice of bread from her hand like a nervous squirrel, and retreated to the spot by the door. He devoured it in 3 huge bites, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting someone to leap out and snatch it back. He licked the butter from his fingers, his gaze never leaving her. A small, sad smile touched Mara's lips. She cut another slice, just as thick, and placed it on the table. "There's more when you want it," she said. She turned her back on him then, a deliberate act of trust. She went to the hearth and added a small log to the fire. The flames licked at the new wood, and a shower of bright orange sparks danced up the chimney. The room grew a little warmer, a little brighter. She was rekindling the hearth, not just for warmth, but for him. Jem watched her every move. He watched her hang her worn coat on a peg by the door. He watched her tie a faded apron around her waist, one smeared with old soot and flour. He watched her move around the small room with a quiet efficiency, her movements slow and deliberate. She wasn't looking at him, but he felt her awareness of him in the room, a gentle, constant presence. She took a kettle and filled it with water from a bucket by the sink. She swung the small iron arm over the fire and hung the kettle there to boil. She didn't hum. She didn't speak. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the soft scrape of her boots on the wood floor, and the frantic beating of Jem's own heart. He stayed by the door for what felt like an hour. It was his escape route. He needed to know he could run. But the longer he stood there, the more the warmth from the fire seeped into his thin shirt, chasing away the deep, biting cold in his bones. The smell of the bread and the wood smoke filled his head. It was a safe smell. He had forgotten what safe smelled like. Slowly, inch by inch, he moved away from the door. He crept toward the table, his eyes on the second slice of bread. He was still wary, still ready to bolt, but a tentative curiosity was beginning to bloom in the barren soil of his fear. He reached the table. He looked at the chair. It was a simple, straight-backed chair, but it looked like a throne to him. No one had ever offered him a seat at a table. He looked over at Mara. She was standing by the sink now, her back still to him, washing something in a basin. She knew he was there. She had to. But she didn't turn. She was giving him the space to make his own choice. He pulled the chair out. It scraped loudly against the floor, and he froze, his heart leaping into his throat. Mara didn't react. She just kept washing. He swallowed hard and sat down. The chair was hard, but it felt solid beneath him. He was at a table, in a house, with a fire. He reached out a trembling hand and took the second slice of bread. This time, he didn't devour it. He took a small bite. He chewed it slowly, making it last. The taste of it, the simple, honest taste of bread and butter, was the most wonderful thing he had ever known. He looked around the room from his new vantage point. He saw the patchwork quilt on the bed, its colors faded, but its stitches neat and small. He saw a single, small, carved wooden bird sitting on the mantelpiece above the fire. He saw the way the light from the window fell across the floorboards, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It was just a room, a poor, simple room. But to Jem, it was a kingdom. Mara finished her washing. She dried her hands on her apron and turned. She saw him there at the table, eating the bread. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It was a phantom feeling, a memory of her own 2 boys sitting at that same table, their hair damp from playing in the snow, their faces bright with life. The chair Jem was sitting in had been Thomas's chair. The other one, empty, had been Samuel's. For a moment the grief was so sharp, so fresh, it stole her breath. She closed her eyes, steadying herself against the sink. This was not Thomas. This was not Samuel. This was a different boy, a lost boy. And she was a different woman. She was not the mother she had been. She was something else now, something forged in the fire of loss and silence. She opened her eyes. The ghost of her sons receded, leaving only the reality of the small, dark-haired child sitting at her table. The kettle began to whistle, a thin, piercing sound. Mara moved to it, her composure regained. She poured the hot water into 2 mugs. She didn't have tea, not really. But she took a small tin from the shelf and spooned a bit of dried mint and honey into each mug. She stirred them, the clinking of the spoon against the ceramic, a gentle, domestic sound. She placed 1 mug on the table in front of Jem. He looked down at it, at the steam rising from its surface, carrying the sweet scent of mint. He had never had a mug of his own before. She sat down in the other chair, the one that had been Samuel's. She wrapped her calloused hands around her own warm mug. She didn't press him to talk. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask where he came from or where his parents were. She knew that stories like his were best left unearthed until the ground was softer. For now, it was enough that he was here. It was enough that the chair was not empty. They sat in silence, the boy and the widow, at the simple wooden table. The fire crackled. The winter sun slanted through the clean window. Jem took a hesitant sip of the hot, sweet mint water. It warmed him all the way down to his toes. He looked at the woman across from him. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring into the depths of her own mug, her face a landscape of quiet sorrow and fierce, newfound purpose. He didn't know what she was thinking. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow or the day after. But for the first time in his memory, the gnawing beast in his gut was quiet. It was warm. It was full. And he was safe. He held his mug with both hands, a small, sacred warmth in the vast, cold world. The days that followed fell into a quiet, fragile rhythm. They were measured not by the clock on the town hall, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the stoking of the fire, and the slow, cautious dance of 2 wounded souls learning to share a space. Mara never asked Jem for his story. She seemed to understand that his past was a haunted place, and that he would only venture back into it when he was ready. Instead, she built a present for him, moment by careful moment. She taught him without teaching. She would rise before the sun, and the sound of her moving about the small house would wake him. He slept on a pallet of blankets she'd made for him by the hearth, a place of honor, the warmest spot in the house. He would watch her through slitted eyes as she added wood to the embers, her movements economical and sure. He learned the difference between kindling and hardwood just by watching her hands. One morning, she was kneading dough on a floured board at the table. She worked the dough with a practiced strength, folding and pushing, folding and pushing. Jem sat on his pallet, mesmerized by the motion. After a few minutes, she stopped. She looked over at him, then cut a small lump of dough from the main ball. She placed it on the board in front of the empty chair, Samuel's chair. She didn't say a word. She just went back to her own work. Jem watched the small lump of dough for a long time. It was an invitation, a question without words. He slowly got up, his heart thumping. He climbed into the chair. He looked at his own hands, still grimy despite the basin of water she left for him each morning. He looked at hers, dusted with white flour. He reached out and poked the dough. It was soft, alive. He began to mimic her movements, pushing and folding the small lump with his clumsy fingers. It stuck to his hands and the board, a messy, hopeless effort. Mara didn't correct him. She didn't criticize. She just kept working on her own loaf. After a while, she paused, took a handful of flour, and sprinkled it over his hands and his dough. Keeps it from sticking. she said, her voice quiet. It was the first piece of instruction she had given him. He nodded, his cheeks flushed with concentration, and went back to work. His small loaf was lumpy and misshapen, but when Mara slid her own perfect loaf into the small oven built into the side of the hearth, she slid his in right beside it. The smell of baking bread that filled the house an hour later was the smell of belonging. The town of Timbermouth did not forget. They watched. When Mara went to the general store for supplies, a hush would fall over the patrons. They would watch her buy a little more flour than usual, an extra bag of beans, a small jar of molasses. Sheriff Thorne would stand outside, leaning against a post, his eyes following her. He never said anything. He didn't have to. His presence was a constant, silent question, a reminder that the peace was conditional. One afternoon, a rock clattered against the side of the house. Jem, who had been carefully tracing the patterns in the wood grain of the floor, jumped as if he'd been shot. He scrambled behind the bed, his eyes wide with the familiar, hunted look she had seen on the first day. Mara, who had been mending one of his thin shirts, put her sewing down. She didn't go to the window. She didn't shout into the street. She walked over to the place where he was hiding, her face calm. She sat down on the floor, her back against the bed frame, so she was on his level. "It's just a rock," she said softly. "It's a coward's weapon. It can't hurt us in here." He peeked out at her from behind the dusty bedpost. "They hate me," he whispered, the first time he had spoken of the town. "They don't know you," she corrected gently. "They're afraid. Fear makes people ugly." She picked up the shirt she had been mending. It was his only shirt, threadbare and torn at the elbow. She had patched it with a piece of cloth from one of her husband's old work shirts. The patch was a darker blue, a sturdy, strong square against the faded gray. She held it out to him. "Look," she said. "I fixed the hole." He crept out from his hiding place and took the shirt. He ran his fingers over the neat, tiny stitches. No one had ever mended anything for him before. Things just fell apart, and you endured. He looked at the patch, then at her. He didn't know how to say thank you. The words were foreign, stuck in his throat. So he just held the shirt to his chest, a small piece of armor against the world. That night, as the wind howled outside, a sound that usually sent a shiver of terror through him, he felt a strange sense of peace. The fire was warm, the house was sturdy, and the woman who moved silently in the dim light was a fortress. He fell asleep watching her, her silhouette framed against the firelight as she sat in her chair, darning a sock. He started to talk, in small, broken fragments. He told her his name was Jem. He didn't say it was short for anything. He didn't say who gave it to him. Just Jem. He told her he liked the way the fire popped. He told her he had once seen a deer with antlers so big they looked like tree branches. The stories were small, safe things, pebbles of information dropped into the quiet pool of their life together. Mara, in turn, shared pieces of herself. She never spoke of the day her boys died. She never spoke of the crushing weight of grief that had hollowed her out. Instead, she told him about the birds. She pointed out the window one morning. "That's a junco," she said. "He's a brave little fellow. Stays all winter." She showed him the small, carved bird on the mantel. "My Thomas carved that," she said, her voice soft. "He was good with his hands." It was the first time she had said one of her son's names aloud in front of him. She didn't cry. She just stated it as a fact, a piece of a life that had been lived in this house. Jem looked at the bird with a new reverence. He was sleeping in a house full of ghosts, but they weren't scary ghosts. They were quiet, sad ghosts, and Mara was their gentle keeper. One day, he found a piece of charcoal from the hearth. He took a piece of brown wrapping paper she had saved from a purchase at the store. He sat at the table, Samuel's chair, and began to draw. He drew the house. He drew the fire. He drew a stick figure of a woman with a triangle skirt and a circle head, and a smaller stick figure beside her. He gave them both smiling faces. When Mara saw it, she didn't praise it like a doting mother. She looked at it for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she took it and tucked it carefully into a small wooden box where she kept her needles and thread. It was a treasure, a piece of proof. The climax was coming. Mara could feel it in the air, in the way the silence from the town was growing heavier, more menacing. It wasn't just whispers anymore. It was a cold, hard judgment that was solidifying against her. Sheriff Thorne started walking by the house every day, his boots crunching in the snow that had begun to fall. He was giving her a chance to give up, to send the boy away, and return to her quiet, invisible life. But Mara would not bend. She had rekindled her hearth, and she would not let the cold wind of their fear blow it out. One morning there was a knock on the door. Not a friendly knock. It was a hard official rap of knuckles on wood. Jem, who was at the table trying to learn how to write his name with the charcoal, froze. His eyes darted to Mara, wide with terror. Mara put a calming hand on his shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered. She stood up, straightened her apron, and walked to the door. She opened it. Sheriff Thorne stood on the porch. Behind him were two other men from the town council, their faces grim and set. They were not here for a social call. "Mara," the sheriff said, his voice devoid of its usual tired kindness. It was the voice of the law. "We need to talk." "We are talking," she said, not moving from the doorway. "This has gone on long enough," one of the councilmen, a portly man named Henderson, said, stepping forward. "The whole town is unsettled. You're harboring a thief and pretending he's your son. It's against God and nature." "What do you know of God or nature?" Mara shot back, her voice sharp. "You, who would have let him hang for a mouthful of bread." "That's enough," Thorne said, holding up a hand. "Mara, we have a duty to maintain order. We can't have people just claiming children. There are rules. We need proof. You need to prove to us that this boy is yours." The demand hung in the cold air. Proof. What proof could she possibly have? She had no papers, no witnesses. She had only the impossible, unbelievable claim she had made in the dust of the town square. This was their checkmate. They had her cornered. They knew she had nothing. Jem, listening from the table, felt a cold dread wash over him. It was over. She would have to give him up. The warmth, the bread, the mended shirt, it was all just a dream, and he was about to wake up. But Mara did not look defeated. She looked calm, a strange, fierce calm. She looked at the three men standing on her porch, their faces smug with certainty. She held their gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, you want proof. I'll give you proof." She stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," she said. It was not an invitation. It was a command. The three men exchanged a look of surprise and suspicion. They stepped cautiously into the small house, their bulk seeming to shrink the room. They looked around, at the clean floor, the warm fire, the boy frozen at the table. Mara ignored them. She walked to the far end of the room, to the foot of her narrow bed. There sat a heavy, dust-covered trunk. It was her husband's trunk, the one he had brought with him from the east. She hadn't opened it in years. It was full of his things, of her wedding dress, of the 2 small blankets she had knitted for her babies. It was a trunk of ghosts. She knelt before it, her back to the men. She ran her hand over the dusty lid. Then, with a deep breath, she unlatched it. The hinges groaned in protest. She lifted the heavy lid. The men watched, expecting... what? Old letters? A family Bible? Some trinket from a forgotten past that she would try to pass off as evidence? Mara reached into the trunk, but she didn't pull out a yellowed photograph or a silver locket. The first thing she pulled out was a small, lumpy, misshapen loaf of bread, now hard as a rock. She held it up. "This is the first bread he ever made," she said, her voice clear and steady. "He made it right there, at that table. He had flour all over his face. He was so proud." She placed the small loaf gently on the floor and reached back into the trunk. She pulled out a gray shirt, a faded patch of dark blue sewn neatly onto the elbow. "This is his shirt," she said, her voice growing stronger. "There was a hole in it. I mended it for him while he slept by the fire. He was afraid of the dark, so I left a candle burning for him." Next, she pulled out a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings uneven, its shape barely recognizable. It was nothing like the perfect one on the mantel. "He made this," she said, a hint of a tremor in her voice now, a tremor of pure love. "He wanted to make one like his brothers. He used my husband's old knife. He cut his finger, right here." She pointed to a tiny, dark spot on the wood. "I cleaned it for him and wrapped it in a clean cloth. He cried, not because it hurt, but because he was afraid I'd be angry he used the knife without asking." She placed the bird beside the bread and the shirt. Her hands were moving more quickly now, pulling out the treasures of their short life together. She pulled out the piece of brown wrapping paper with the 2 smiling stick figures on it. "This is our family," she said, holding it up for them to see. "He drew it himself. That's me, and that's him. He said he made us smiling because the house is not quiet anymore." Finally, she reached deep into the trunk, past the folded blankets and the scent of lavender and memory, and she pulled out the very first thing, the half-eaten loaf of bread from the day she found him. It was wrapped carefully in a clean napkin. It was stale, hard, and worthless. She held it in her palm as if it were a precious jewel. "And this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "this is the bread he stole because he was starving. This is the bread that made him my son. You ask for proof? Here is my proof." She gestured to the small, pathetic, beautiful collection of items on the floor. The bread, the shirt, the carving, the drawing. A week of a life. A week of becoming a mother. A week of a boy becoming a son. "My proof isn't in a book or on a piece of paper from some government office. My proof is in the living. It's in the mending and the baking. It's in the fear that I wash away and the hope that I am building, crumb by crumb. You want to see the papers that bind him to me? You are looking at them." She stood up, her eyes blazing, tears finally streaming down her face, hot and fierce. "Now you tell me," she demanded, her voice ringing through the small, silent room. "You tell me he is not my son." Sheriff Thorne and the 2 councilmen stood frozen, stunned into silence. They had come expecting a legal argument, a desperate plea. They had not expected this. They had not expected a sermon preached with scraps and memories. They looked from Mara's tear-streaked, defiant face to the small, sacred pile of evidence on the floor. They looked at the boy, Jem, who was no longer frozen in fear, but was staring at Mara with an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. The law had no answer for this. Their rules were brittle things, and she had just shattered them with the sheer, undeniable weight of her love. Henderson, the portly councilman, looked down at his own feet, a flush of shame creeping up his neck. The other man just stared, his mouth slightly agape. Sheriff Thorne was a man of order, a man of the law, but he was also a man who had stood at the graves of Mara's children. He saw now what he had refused to see before. She had not gone mad with grief. Her grief had hollowed her out, yes, but it had made a space that this lost boy had filled. She had not stolen a child. She had rescued one, and in doing so, she had rescued herself. He slowly took off his hat, crushing the brim in his hand. He looked at Mara, and for the first time, he saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a force to be reckoned with. "No, Mara," he said, his voice quiet and rough. "I can't tell you that." He turned without another word and walked out the door. The other 2 men followed him like chastened dogs, stumbling out of the little house and back into the cold reality of their town. They left the door open behind them. The silence that descended on the room was different now. It was not the silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the silence of victory, of peace, of truth. Mara stood for a long moment, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. Then a shuddering sob escaped her. She sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. She wept. She wept for her lost boys, for the years of silence, for the terror of the morning, for the fierce, impossible love, that had taken root in her broken heart. Jem slid from his chair. He walked over to her, his steps no longer hesitant. He was not afraid of her tears. He knelt in front of her, among the scattered proofs of their life. He didn't know what to say. He had no words for the enormity of what she had just done for him. So he did the only thing he could think of. He reached out his small hands and placed them on top of hers. She lowered her hands from her face and looked at him through her tears. He looked back, his dark eyes clear and steady. He wasn't a stray. He wasn't a thief. He was her son. He leaned forward, and with a startling, simple grace, he wrapped his arms around her neck. He hugged her. It was a clumsy, childish hug, but it was the most real thing in the world. Mara's arms came up and encircled him, holding him tight against her. She buried her face in his messy, dark hair and held on, the two of them kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of their newfound family. The hearth was not just rekindled, it was a blazing fire. After a long time, they drew apart. The town was still outside, the world was still cold, but in that small room, a sanctuary had been consecrated. Mara gathered up the shirt, the drawing, the carving, and the 2 loaves of bread, and she placed them carefully back in the trunk. They were not just things anymore. They were their history, their beginning. That evening they sat at the table, eating a simple stew. The wind had died down. The house was quiet. Jem looked across at Mara, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the lamp. The lines of sorrow were still there, but they were softer now, gentler. He reached his hand across the table. Mara looked down at it, then placed her own hand in his. His fingers were small, but they were strong. He held her hand tighter than the rope ever could have.